Welcome to Hot, Cold, Wet, and Dry, My Life on the Road. I'm David Cranmer, and I'll be your host for this weekly series where we'll talk about motorcycle travel. In addition to talking about my life on the road, I'd like to hear from you and your stories. Anything from favorite trips to favorite motorcycles would make for great topics in future episodes. You can send them to me at stories@hotcoldwetandDry.com, and I'll either talk about them on the podcast or possibly have you join me during an episode. In this episode, we'll talk about how I got started in motorcycling. Now, if we're going to talk about motorcycle travel, it all had to start somewhere, didn't it? So let me review for a little bit and just tell you how I got into motorcycling and how over time that morphed into this travel bug I've got. You know, as I thought back on it, I realized that motorcycles were not always on my radar. And what changed that? Well, I'm not 100% sure, and we're going to talk with a couple of my friends here in a bit and get their take on it. And just like you, I had a close group of friends in high school. We always hung out together, talked about all sorts of things. And my closest friends were Mike Babb, Rick Finch, and Doug Norton. So I'm not really sure how it happened, but I can remember one day, Rick turned up with a 160 Honda Scrambler. And I thought, well, that's kind of cool. What's going on with that? Well, to understand what Rick did, you got to understand a little bit about his family, too. They were heavy into mechanics. In fact, if you walked into their basement, it was basically a machine shop, every tool known to man. And more so, if you needed a piece of metal to work on, it was probably in there somewhere. Amazing situation. They had Jags with Chevy engines in them, and it was quite an eclectic mix in there. Okay, so Rick ended up with this 160 Honda. And Rick being Rick, immediately started modifying it. He repainted it a beautiful burgundy color. We'll call it maroon right now. Put shorty mufflers on it, some low mirrors on the front to make it look like a cafe racer. Hopped it up, and that was just neat as it could be. You know, it was funny. I was talking to Mike, I guess I was talking to you about it, saying, you know, my earliest recollection is Rick's 160 Honda. You know, the paint job, the shorty fenders, the mufflers, all that sort of stuff on it. But I couldn't remember how Rick got into it. Rick, can you just tell me again about the scooter and all that, how you started on that?
Yeah. I had a neighbor down the street. You all knew Brooks Smalley.
Yeah.
So we were good friends. And Brooks' dad had an Allstate 250.
Cool.
You know, little Twingle. And I was following him somewhere, and we pulled off into a school parking lot, and he let me ride that 250. And that's the first bike ride, a motorcycle I'd ever ridden. I really liked it. But the thing that really started it was my brother. He was a great guy, and he just passed away, but he was really a super brother. But he was going to Georgia Tech at the time and co-oping, and his buddies were getting into motorcycles, and he bought a CL 305 Honda from a place called Thompson Tractor in Blairsville, Georgia. We drove his old Jag up to Blairsville, and he literally learned to ride that bike, driving it back to Smyrna.
Yep.
But he would let me, I mean, he's a great brother. He'd let me take that bike to school and drive it around and stuff like that. And I painted it and did the same thing. I can't leave anything alone. I'll pinch put shorty mufflers, different mufflers on it and all that stuff. But for years, I drove that 305 around. That was my first real bike, I guess.
Yeah, I remember that one now after you talked about it. Now, that wasn't, the Super Hawk was a street version, wasn't it? And his was the Scrambler?
That was a CB 305.
Yeah, okay, yeah, I remember that. So Mike and I were kind of hooked. Took Doug a little longer, and we'll address him a little later. And Mike and I said maybe that's something we ought to get into. Well, there were a couple obstacles to that. And the first obstacle, of course, was my parents. They were anything but enthusiastic about me riding a motorcycle. And it took quite a long time for me to convince them that this was a thing to do. As I remember, it was probably about a year. And I showed them brochures and talked about the fun I could have and how safe I would be and just on and on and on. And finally broke them down. And they finally agreed to it. Now, the second obstacle I had, of course, was money. Now, I'd been working and I saved up some money and I had enough to buy a used motorcycle. So I started searching the ads for something similar to Rick's, another 160 Honda Scrambler. And I found one. So my good parents said, okay, we'll take you over to look at it. And we got together one weekend and went over and took a look at it. And in retrospect, I mean, this was a piece of junk. Horrible, horrible motorcycle, but I wanted it. So the young guy that owned it said, hey, you want to take a test drive? I said, sure. Well, you got to realize, number one, I had no protective gear with me. No helmets, no gloves, no over the ankle boots, no jacket, nothing. And how many times I'd been on a motorcycle? Zero at this point. He gave me the key to it. I kick-started it and took off down the road. I thought, man, this is fantastic. I was really enjoying myself. So I got to the end of the road and turned around and started back. And I still don't know what happened, but at some point, my right hand gave it full throttle, my left hand flew off the handlebars, and I was totally out of control heading down the road. Now, I can't say it was skill, but through pure good luck, I was able to get the bike under control and back to the owner's house. And got there and parked it. And about that time, my parents said, let's talk about this a little bit. So I said, okay. So we got in the car and started heading home. Now, my parents were blue-collar workers, didn't have a lot of money, but what they offered was, they said, how much more money do you need to buy a new one? Well, at the time, it was only a few $100s, but that was big numbers back then. So I gave them the number and they said, okay, we'll give you the extra you need to buy a new motorcycle. Well, fantastic. The next week or so, we got together and I went down to the Honda dealer in Atlanta, about 20 miles from where we lived. Walked in the dealership there, and there sat this brand new 1968 and a half 175 Honda Scrambler. Spectacular, man. I really, really wanted it. So we made the deal on it, and it probably wasn't much of a deal. We probably paid a list price for it and got the motorcycle. At that time, the dealership said, we'll give you a helmet to go along with it. Well, that was pretty nice. Now, for those of you that have been around a while, what they gave me was a half helmet. You know, the little white beanie on top and the leather sides down the side. Even back then, I knew that wasn't what I wanted. So I bought a separate 3/4 helmet. And I told the salesman, I said, okay, now I want one of those bubble shields to go on it. If you see those, it looks like a fishbowl that goes in the front of a helmet. And to his credit, he tried to talk me out of that. He said, you know, you're really not going to like that. But being a teenager, I said, oh, absolutely, I'm going to like that. And bought the shield, put it on the helmet, and he was right. On the ride home, I felt like I was in a fishbowl, and that was the one and only time I ever used that shield. Now, the ride home was uneventful. The 20-mile ride was great. Didn't even stall the motorcycle. And by the time I got home, I was absolutely ecstatic about this motorcycle. So Dad took a look at it and said, man, I like that. Would you mind if I tried it? I said, well, sure. I mean, you helped buy it. So he hopped on it, did 3 mini wheel stands up the driveway, stopped at the top of the driveway, parked it, and said, that's it, I'm done. So thus began the journey. Once I broke my parents down, Mike's weren't far behind, and Mike went out and bought a used 160 Honda Scrambler. So now there were 3 of us, and we went everywhere on those bikes, mostly off-road. We started off in the dirt, and that's where a lot of our skills came from, and all those ultimately transferred to street riding. Mike, do you remember all that?
Yeah, I remember the 305 was what I got my interest in riding motorcycles from. Rick came over one day to the house, and I jumped on the back of it, and he hauled me all over the county.
Man, I was only on the back of a motorcycle one time, and it terrified me. I swore I'd never do it again. Oh, Lord. Yeah, so like I say, for some reason, my memory starts at that 160, and you know how we got together on that. But
Well, Rick took my 160. You know, I bought a 160 myself after, and I was surprised my parents let me get into the motorcycle business, but they said I had been a good son and had not caused any trouble. I think they was trying to kill me off, is what they were trying to do.
Well, didn't I kind of break the ice on that, breaking my parents into it?
Yeah, you broke your parents into it. Like David had a 175, I think, and then we had the 160s. I found the 160 I purchased, and then of course I took it over to Rick's, and he fixed it up for me so it looked more like a dirt bike than anything else. He cut the fenders down, cut the back of it. I remember that like yesterday.
Of course, Rick's the one that got us into all this trouble anyway. But I remember that one particular ride we took, and I forget where it was now. Started going up this dirt hill, and there were ruts on either side of the main track. And Rick went up the center track without a problem, and Mike and I were stuck in the ruts trying to follow him. You remember that one?
That may have been 1968 when y'all came up. The whole town shut down up here back in those days for July the 4th. And my brother and sister, who I was living with at that time, working during the summertime, they went to some lake resort type thing. And you and Rick came up to their house in Dalton, and we followed the Stone Mountain race at that time. I don't know if you remember that or not, but I introduced you to Dalton, and we got to sit in the back of the car, or truck, or whatever it was, and
Yeah.
I think you hauled the motorcycles up to my dad's truck.
Yes. That was the Dr. Social scene. I remember that. Yeah. Yeah, I remember that event now that I brought it up. Yep. And I was actually riding around without a license because I didn't realize that my license had been suspended for something else.
That we won't talk about, huh?
Riding on a suspended license. It was a setup.
We rode from Mill Creek Valley across to where the interstate was being built or had been built. And we took the back roads across to there. I don't think you can even get across that trail anymore.
Yeah.
Of course, that was 50 years ago, so lots changed since then.
God, I know it. Jeez. Longer than 50, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was 68.